Previously on linear. The linear expression. Here I have a speedometer that goes up to 180 miles per hour. I can drive this by putting in the actual speed and it will be represented accurately. When s is 0 to 180, transform this to these second set of values. So that's linear. Welcome back. I've applied the linear expression in several other ways on several other effects. So as we can see here, now we've got things like scale. It zooms in, it's doing a bit of a shake. The dial is glowing, it's also rattling once it passes the 180 threshold. We also have some heat distortion and fire, and then you can see how that has an effect as it gradually creeps up, these things start coming in. The amazing thing about this is that it's still happening off of the same slider value. So amazing for templates where you need to reuse an animation for different scenarios and different instances. So let's create a null object. Move this null where 180 is. Let's parent everything to this null. The background will keep it as is, and now it will zoom in at that point. And then it's a case of once again getting the speed slider and then linear. I want this to start zooming in quite late into the speed. So when we start hitting 140 and above, so 140 to 180, let's do a scale of 100, because you know here it's two values, so you have to write it like this, to 200. You can see that is now working well. What else do we want to add? We want to add a wiggle. So let's actually copy the expression from the scale and just put it on the position. Let's start with a wiggle. Okay, wiggle is simply shaking something, and we want it to shake 12 times per second. That's the first value, and then the second value will be the linear expression. Up to 140, we don't want any wiggle, so that's going to be a 0. And then after that, let's say 10. So now it's saying wiggle 12 times per second. That's the first argument, and the second argument is how much, and linear will give you that. So linear will say it will be up to 10, depending on the speed. Now we click off, it's wiggling as we intended. It might be worth actually doing a simple animation here. So now you can see as you get closer to that speed, it starts zooming in. However, the zoom in is a little bit abrupt. So currently we have linear handling the zoom in. So to get this to zoom in a bit more nicely, you can change linear to something else called ease, which is the same thing. Instead of doing a direct like linear relationship, it has like an ease relationship. You can see these in interpolation. You have the linear versions, then you have the eases, then you have the ease in and then ease out. They all do the same thing. It's just how the relationship is between the two ranges of values. Now let's try this again. So that's pretty good now. As it crosses the 140 threshold, it starts scaling up in a more gradual way. It's not so abrupt and sudden. Let's do the dial. As it kind of reaches this place, I want it to glow. I'm going to use this plugin called Deep Glow. It's a paid plugin. You can use your normal glow, but this is just to demonstrate how we can use this. So let's go to the exposure. We're going to grab that speed slider again, bang. And then we're going to say linear S when we are entering like, once again, 140 to 180. I want the intensity to go from 0 to 1. And there you go. It's now glowing. So you can now start to see how much you can do with this. Once you understand it, once you have a system, you can rig so many things up, and then you have one slider controlling so much. Once it kind of passes that 180 thing, I want it to start vibrating, but I only want it to vibrate outside. It should only be rattling beyond 180. The way we have to do that is we have to go to the rotation, and currently we see it like this. It will only go from -125 to 127. But as you saw in the null, we used something like this, where it was like wiggle, and then the amount it wiggled was dynamic. It was like, it will shake based on a certain thing. So we want to use something similar to that, but not the same. Instead of 127, let's turn this into a value for now. And call it max S, so max speed. What we want is we want to get some additional shake. So let's do that on a separate slider, and we're going to call this wiggle amount. And going to the wiggle amount, we're going to just copy this speed slider, and then it's a linear 180 and above. We only want it to rattle above 180 from 0, so nothing, to about 10, or let's say 6, because this will affect the rotation. And then we have to add a wiggle at the beginning, of course. So you can see here in this value, we can now see when that dial is going past that 180 mark, you can see how it's wiggling. However, you know, it's going below 0 and above. We want it to only go above 0. So there's a little trick called math.abs. And this just makes anything inside it positive. So now when you look at the same thing, we are only getting positive values, which is very good, is what we need. So going back to the rotation, we are now going to grab that additional wiggle amount. You see this? Now that we've added it in, we've added the wiggle amount, this additional kind of noise, and you can see there, it's now working. It's rattling beautifully. If I did not have this absolute, if it was just a wiggle, here's what would happen. It would be shaking in and out of the range. We don't want that. We want it to be shaking only outside and kind of bouncing back against the max, value. Then the one other thing I added was an adjustment layer, and I called this heat distortion. So here's the amount. I'm going to set the size of that to say 20, maybe even smaller. We're going to get the amount. We're going to copy that expression in that we've been using everywhere else. And then we're going to say, as it reaches the say 160 mark, from 160 to 200 miles per hour, we want the amount to go from 0 to 50. And now let's have a look. See, everything starts melting at those high speeds. Let's add a fireball. Here's a fireball I prepared earlier, just some footage of fire. And we're going to do a couple of things with this. With the opacity, same thing. It's just applying this now to as many properties as possible. We want this to fade in a lot sooner than this because that fade in is very artificial. Okay, so we want it to happen pretty quickly. However, we do want it to kind of come up in brightness. So we're going to add an exposure effect and animate the gamma. Okay, so here we go, gamma. And we're going to say from 160 to say 180. We're going to go from 0.1, which is the minimum value this property can be, to say 0.6. That just gives you a bit more detail. And let's set this to add, and let's have a look. Look at that. So you can see it fades in pretty fast, but then the gamma is also helping it fade in and out. For the last thing that we're going to add a displacement map using that fireball. We're going to set it to 6 and -8. These are the values I used. Okay, so right now it's always happening. The fire's always there. We don't want that. We only want it when you're in those speeds. So from about 160 to 190, that should go up to 6. And for vertical displacement, -8. You can see it's only distorting when it's hitting those speeds. Though you may have noticed that it's kind of cropping in at the edges here because of the way displacement map works. So to fix that, we're going to add a transform. We can scale it up to hide this. Same thing here, from 160 to 190, 100 to 105. Okay, bang, now that's zoomed in. And you can't tell because everything's already scaling in. That's it. Once you understand the concept of linear, you can start throwing it at different properties and create these advanced systems that look very complicated, but actually they're pretty simple.